tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by Jeff Cohen. Jeff is the founding director of the Parks Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College, where he is an associate professor of journalism. The former senior producer for MSNBC's Donahue program, he's appeared as a political commentator in national media and helped found both the media watchdog group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, as well as the activism site rootsaction.org. Jeff is also the author of numerous books, including his most recent, Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. Jeff Cohen, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you.
Great to have you with us. Let's start with you. What got you started in media? What drew you to media in the first place?
Well, mainstream media almost killed me. I grew up in the Vietnam generation, and I was, unlike most kids of 13, 14, 15, I was a mainstream media junkie. I would come home and watch the national news. I would read Time magazine, and I was a complete war hawk. And in junior high, early high school, I wrote an essay attacking the football quarterback at the time, Joe Namath, because he wouldn't go and fight in Vietnam.
Whoa.
And I said he won't go and defend his country by fighting in Vietnam. So my attitudes were totally whacked. And I look back on it a couple of years later. But until the age of 16, I'd never heard of alternative media. I didn't know about Ramparts magazine. I didn't know about underground weeklies. I'd never seen Harper's magazine. But at age 16, I started looking at this stuff. And so while the mainstream media nearly killed me by getting me to go to Vietnam, like so many people of our generation went to Vietnam thinking they were doing a great thing and liberating people. So I was one of those people taken in by the mainstream media, and when the light bulbs went off and my eyes got opened and I started having access to alternative sources, that's when I realized that I needed to be working in media but critiquing media. And I'll tell you the culminating incident, I was probably about 20 years old when the Vietnam veterans came to Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up. And they had the winter soldier hearings where these Vietnam vets returning from the war had testified in a public forum about the atrocities they'd been part of, the atrocities they'd witnessed, the racism behind the war against Vietnam. And it was just eye-opening for me. And in the middle of one of the most emotional guys were talking about things they'd witnessed in Vietnam. It showed why the people of Vietnam were not on our side. During the middle of it, very emotional testimony, the one camera crew from a mainstream outlet that had shown up starts packing up. And back then it was like lighting guy and, you know, it was a huge thing. And the Vietnam vets started booing. Because many of them blamed the mainstream media in 1965, 66, 67, 68 for getting them to go to Vietnam in the first place. And so seeing how impactful the mainstream media were and how they basically censored this huge event of returning Vietnam veterans who were testifying to the American public, this is what the war is really about. And the mainstream media wouldn't cover it. I would say that's the day I became a media critic.
Wow, that's extraordinary. I remember back during those times, before my own, you know, I went through kind of a similar arc when I was 13 in '64. I went door to door with my dad for Barry Goldwater, and my dad and I used to sit and watch William F. Buckley's Firing Line every weekend. And I still look back on that. I've been looking for old clips. They're hard to find. As actually great programming, even though Buckley was a conservative. I'm curious.
Buckley, yes, but Buckley often had on opposing views like you do today, and he'd let them talk like you do today. So, I mean, Buckley's show was actually one of the better ones in that era. While he was a complete war hawk, a monster hawk, fanatically hawkish on Vietnam, he had people like Noam Chomsky on the air. He had Allen Ginsberg on.
I remember his interview with Frank Zappa.
Yeah, and so, yes, Firing Line, while the host was right-wing, it did provide some alternative views. What I was watching every night was Cronkite and NBC, Huntley Brinkley, NBC News, Evening News, and those guys were just giving us war propaganda. And the Vietnam War was presented as this, we're liberating the people. And will we have the commitment to stand by the Vietnamese people? Well, by the time these reports were airing, the Vietnamese people, we know from the Pentagon Papers, and we know that the war planners knew it at the time, the Vietnamese people had turned against the U.S., did not ever see them as saviors, but we were being propagandized. And I would say, going through the Vietnam experience, where I almost was ready at the age of 15, 16 to enlist, and then seeing that the U.S. mainstream media had been propagandizing me and millions of people, and then seeing when the Vietnam veterans came home to tell us the truth, here's the real story of what we witnessed. And they weren't allowed on the mainstream media by and large. That's what turned me into a media critic.
What was your entry into the media, and what have you done?
I started writing investigative pieces for alternative publications when I was very young. I wrote for the Detroit Fifth Estate, an alternative weekly, Michigan Sun, New Times. And my expertise at the beginning was I wrote about the Martin Luther King assassination. I wrote about FBI and CIA abuse. When the documents were coming out, the internal documents were coming out in the 1974-75. So that's where I really started. And after being sort of a freelance journalist for alternative media, I then I had a knack for getting, in spite of all the biases of corporate mainstream media, I had a knack for getting independent views into the media and getting myself into the mainstream. So I started teaching classes when I was living in Los Angeles. Is the whole world watching? If not, why not? Madison Avenue meets the progressive movement, where people would send a representative from every group in LA, National Organization for Women, the Iranian students who stood for democracy. They'd all send a representative, and I teach, here's the best way you can try to get in the mainstream media in spite of their biases. And it was after doing all that work, working in alternative media, trying to get in the mainstream media, that I founded FAIR in 1986 as a group that would just 24/7 critique the mainstream media, expose something novel, which is who owns the media. Most Americans don't even know who owns their media. And that's what we set about starting to do in 1986. And our goal was to get people to look at the media critically and politically. I'd be in a room full of activists, and I'd ask people at the beginning of FAIR, how many of you ever protested a federal building over some federal policy or war? And almost all the hands would go up. How many of you protested outside of City Hall or a police department over police brutality or some police abuse? Hands would go up. I'd go on, and a big corporate office over environmental or labor abuse, the hands go up. How many of you have ever protested outside of a media outlet? And no hands would go up. So we formed FAIR in 1986 because we wanted people to understand that the media corporations, the media outlets, are powerful political institutions. They have political biases. They need to be dealt with politically. They need to be critiqued politically, and people have to make demands on those outlets. You may not win a lot of your demands, but in making demands of the corporate media, you're telling your fellow citizens, here's the shortcomings and biases and censored stories within the corporate media.
1986 was the year before Reagan stopped the enforcement of the Fairness Doctrine, which fundamentally changed the way news is done in the United States, at least. And all the news divisions came under the entertainment vice presidents over the next 2 years. What's your analysis, your critique, of how the media has changed from the time you founded FAIR until today?
It was around the time we founded FAIR in '86 that all of the TV networks went under ownership changes. They were already big companies, and they got bought out by even bigger companies. General Electric, for example, took over NBC. For a while, Westinghouse, another big nuclear power company, took over CBS. So we started FAIR when the media in Washington, D.C. was on bended knee putting clothes on the naked Emperor Reagan, making a guy they knew would fall asleep at meetings, making this guy look better than they knew him to be. So the Washington Press Corps was soft. The ownership was getting even more and more concentrated in fewer hands, bigger corporate hands. And so we formed FAIR then, and what I've seen since FAIR was founded is while there are now millions of people, several million people who get their news from like your shows, There's several million people that just don't trust the mainstream media, can see through the mainstream media. And while I think FAIR has played a role in educating people about how bad the corporate mainstream media are, I can't say that the demands we've made on the mainstream media, except for the short haul, at brief times, has improved the mainstream media at all. I'm a big advocate, as you know, for independent media. That's the key. The key is to look at media that are not owned by the giant U.S. corporations, are not sponsored by the giant U.S. corporations. Independent media are growing, nonprofit media are growing thanks to the internet. That's the thing, that's what's optimistic. But in terms of corporate mainstream media getting any better because FAIR existed since 1986, no, they haven't. But millions of people have awakened to mainstream media, and that's a big victory for FAIR and independent-minded hosts and journalists like you.
Yeah, I think so. And not just minded. I actually own this show.
Yes.
And I own my radio show.
Yes.
And have
yes,
complete
your
control
independent
over the
media.
content of
Amy Goodman's independent media. CommonDreams.org, independent media. Truth Dig, Truth Out, Alternet. As long as the internet remains free and non-discriminatory, where the Comcasts and Verizons cannot discriminate by putting shows like yours or websites like Democracy Now! And Common Dreams in a slow lane, right, and then the outlets that they make profit off of or get a cut from get in a fast lane. If we can maintain net neutrality and a non-discriminatory internet, independent media will keep growing, and it's a big if.
Right, both on the left or the right and every place else.
And in between.
Yeah, and we only have about 2 minutes until the break, but we can, I'm guessing this conversation on this topic will take longer than that, but I'm curious your thoughts about how at one time it was ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, the local paper, basically media was fairly small, the spectrum of things. Today it's huge. At least it appears that way. And particularly with regard to cable news has become a very different thing than the evening news on network news. I'm curious your thoughts about those two.
Well, I remember when cable started, cable television, before CNN and Ted Turner started CNN. And I would be told, oh, don't worry about media anymore. Everyone's going to have their own station. Ralph Nader's going to have a consumer rights station. You know, this group's going to have a station. The unions will have their own network. Well, that never happened. Cable television became as concentrated. A half a dozen corporations started taking over all of the channels. So while we have access to hundreds of channels, most of them are still owned by a few companies. Those companies are Comcast, General Electric, Viacom, Time Warner. So it's still a few companies that are owning hundreds of channels. In the old Soviet Union, they had hundreds and hundreds of outlets, but they were all owned by the Soviet state or the Soviet Union, you know, the party or the state.
And here we are, and it seems like we're reinventing that. More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Jeff Cohen right after this break. Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Jeff Cohen, professor and founding director of the Parks Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College and author of numerous books, including Cable News Confidential, My Misadventures in Corporate Media. So, Jeff, back to how media has changed from '86 when you founded FAIR until today. 4 years earlier, 4 years before '86, Reagan had stopped functionally enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so we saw this brand new creature on the American scene, not just the media scene, the M&A artists, the mergers and acquisitions people, the Michael Milkens, the Mitt Romneys of the world.
And it played a huge role in newspapers, because we used to have, in cities, there would be sometimes 2, 3, in big cities, 5, 6, 8 newspapers. By the time we got to the 70s, there were a lot of 2 newspaper towns. But then the mergers started happening, and a few companies started chaining up all the big newspapers. And to chain them up, they would go into debt. And to be able to, for these few corporations to grow vast at the expense of newspaper diversity, they would cut staff. And so corporate greed was hurting the American newspaper way before the internet, anyone had heard of the internet. And so when you talk about how the internet's wiping out daily newspapers, and daily newspapers are so important in American political life, corporate greed was killing the newspapers, and they weakened newspapers so badly that by the time the internet came along, they couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't defend their circulation. They couldn't defend their revenue. So that's something that's always left out. I think back at the high point of mainstream media as the early 70s. That was the period of Woodward and Bernstein and Watergate. That was the period where mainstream dailies, one after another, first the New York Times, then the Washington Post, then the Boston Globe, St. Louis Post, they committed civil disobedience in publishing the Pentagon Papers, telling the truth about Vietnam. And after one newspaper would be enjoined, the other newspapers would start publishing. So that was the high point. And when you think about where have we come from 70s, to today, I think about Bob Woodward at the Washington Post, where he and Bernstein unraveled this conspiracy and brought down a president. And you think about Woodward in the last 10, 12 years, and he's basically cozy with presidents, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. The establishment media has grown even cozier with the establishment. The corporate ownership has got the owners more webbed up with power. I remember in 2004, Sumner Redstone, who owned CBS for years and Viacom, known as a liberal. And they said, who are you endorsing for president in 2004? And he was a friend of, from Massachusetts, he was a friend of John Kerry's. Look, I'm endorsing the Republicans because I know I vote Viacom. This isn't me, I'm Viacom. And big media conglomerates do better with the Republican in the White House. That's what he said in 2004 when he endorsed. So we've had this problem at the ownership level, and we've had this problem where the news stars, the journalistic stars, have gotten cozier and cozier with power. So with Jeff Bezos of Amazon taking over the Washington Post, I see all these stories we've seen in recent weeks about the hallowed traditions of the Washington Post, and is Bezos going to ruin them? And I think about, and all these stories talked about the Washington Post with its proud journalistic tradition of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. That was 40 years ago. And the Washington Post has been declining. The person who personifies the Washington Post today is Fred Hyatt, the hawkish editor of the editorial pages, whose editorial pages wrote in 5 months 24, more than 24 editorials pushing for the invasion of Iraq. They smeared anyone who was skeptical about invading Iraq. They didn't, like Pravda, they didn't allow, the old Pravda, didn't allow any dissidents who were skeptics of the invasion of Iraq to appear, but they were regularly savaged in the editorial pages. And you think about the important role that the New York Times front page played in cranking up the invasion of Iraq. Cable news, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, but the editorial pages of the Washington Post was crucial in making the invasion of Iraq possible, that disaster. So it's a far cry from Watergate and Pentagon Papers to Fred Hyatt's Washington Post. He's still on board with Bezos, the Amazon guy, taking over the Washington Post. And so it's the same team. This hallowed tradition of Washington Post journalism has been going downhill. There's, of course, exceptions. Dana Priest has done explosive stories in the last 10 years, including the CIA's black sites, the secret prisons, that showed our war on terror was in many ways a war of terror, a war of kidnapping, and many of the people we kidnapped and tortured were innocent. So I see it as a real decline over a period of years. And you educate your audience every day about the impact of non-enforcement of antitrust. If a few corporations are going to take over the media, you're going to get a journalism that is a product that looks like it's something that's state propaganda from the corporate state. Jeff Bezos, is he going to ruin the Washington Post? Well, the Washington Post has been on a steady decline, but Bezos, we know that one of the most important issues facing journalism today is the surveillance state. And these profiteers, these companies that get 70% of the intelligence budgets, the U.S. intelligence budgets, is money that comes from the taxpayer, and 70% of it is turned over to private contractors. One of those big private contractors for the CIA and spying is Bezos' Amazon. So you've got Amazon totally webbed up with the surveillance state, making big profits from the surveillance state. They hope the $600 million CIA contract that Amazon has for cloud web providing, web services, they hope that's just the beginning. And so the American people have watched a surveillance state grow up next to a warfare state, and that's where our money goes. That's why we can't have universal health care for all. That's why we can't have college education for all free like they do in many advanced European countries. But we can't have a debate about it in the mainstream media. And with Bezos taking over the Washington Post and his company makes profits from the surveillance state, I don't think the Washington Post will do any better, and they've been doing pretty poorly. I think of Snowden and Bradley Manning as sort of windows into how declining mainstream media, the Washington Press Corps. When Dan Ellsberg came out with the Pentagon Papers in 1970-71, he got these newspapers to publish them in full. Bradley Manning has gotten horrible mainstream coverage. Snowden, you have people going on TV asking not only how can we get Snowden, and they use the term we when they're talking about the CIA. They're not supposed to be state propagandists. Our media are not supposed to be state controlled. We're always talking about how our media is different than media in other countries. But if you look at the coverage of Snowden and you see how the big news outlets have basically identified with the state, I saw a guy on CNBC, Ross Aaron Sorkin, asking, how did we let this guy get out of Hong Kong? That was our first mistake. Talking about the government and the CIA as we, as if you were a state propagandist. So they've completely identified with the state and their big issues. How did we get Snowden behind bars? What we really need, and if we had an independent media, they'd be focusing on the revelations that Snowden has shown us, that this money from taxpayers is being wasted on a bloated surveillance state, a bloated warfare state, and the mainstream media can't even pose those questions by and large. That's why independent media is so crucial today.
It seems that one of the pieces of that, you mentioned earlier media stars and TV stars, pre-Reagan, pre-consolidation, pre-all this stuff. People in the media, even on national television, Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, they were not rich.
Right.
They had a damn good salary, but they were not rich.
No doubt.
And now you've got guys, I mean, entry level. You get a primetime TV show, even on a cable network on MSNBC, you're looking at least $1 million a year. And in order for those shows, and usually multiples of that, and in order for those shows to continue working, they have to have guests, because it's all been this star culture. And so if the White House won't send their people, or if the Republican Party or the Democratic Party shut them out, or if John McCain won't show up, their shows collapse, their income goes away, and people wonder why these people suck up to these folks.
You've hit on the two big issues. They are so wealthy that they are cozy with the corporate and political elite. That's their brethren. And number two, when you hear the word TV news show in the mainstream, the operative word is show. It's entertainment, and they need the stars. I learned when I worked at MSNBC in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq that the reason they despised and feared Phil Donahue and then terminated us 3 weeks before the invasion is because it was interfering with them getting the stars. They couldn't book the secretaries of defense, the secretaries of state, the assistant secretaries of defense and state, the heads and former heads of the CIA, because Phil Donahue was raising questions about the invasion of Iraq. Now, all the questions we raised turned out to be the right one. And when you look at the mainstream media, talk about the decline. Fred Hyatt at the Washington Post, who was so wrong on the invasion of Iraq, he's only gained more power. He's still the editorial page editor of the Washington Post. I know of no one in mainstream TV who lost their job or got sanctioned because they got the biggest foreign policy story of recent decades totally wrong, the invasion of Iraq. Like these people, almost all of them did, but the Phil Donahues, people like me, we were kicked out of the media system.
Bill Maher, too.
Many. I mean, after my book came out, Cable News Confidential, I heard from journalists big and small who lost their jobs because they questioned the invasion of Iraq. Almost none of us were rehired when we were proven right about the wrongness of invading Iraq.
Right. We have about a minute and a half left. I'm curious your thoughts on what the average person who's watching this program right now can do to try to improve their media diet and improve the variety of things available.
Support independent media. When you learn things on Tom Hartman's radio or TV shows, spread it around by internet. We have, for now, this amazing tool that allows all of us to be publishers. And so I encourage people, don't get your news from mainstream corporate media. Look for all these alternatives, and there are more now than ever. And then when you see great stuff, send it to all your friends. It's that peer-to-peer way that we can fight the big corporate media. They're fatter and richer than ever. But there are these alternatives at the base.
But yet at the same time, there are also what appear to be alternative and independent media that are actually being funded by billionaires and right-wingers. They typically exist on the right that are portraying themselves as this is the independent voice of truth.
Yeah, Fox News.
Well, and there are others who are much smaller. But how do you filter that stuff?
Well, again, we believe that the more diverse sources you have, the more chance you have of finding out what truth is. I wouldn't filter. I'd look at right-wing and left-wing and middle-of-the-road sources and come to your own conclusions. But send stuff around that you're not getting in the mainstream. Help build independent media by spreading the word about them.
Yeah, which brings us to a conversation that we'll have to have another day about the siloization of American media. But Jeff, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
To see this and other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com.